Welcome. Good morning. My name is Dominique McCoy, and on behalf of the To&Through Project and the UChicago Consortium, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. The project that we are sharing today is a little bit different, which is something that we're really excited about in the sense that we actually have two resources that we are releasing today. Our new report, Approaching CPS Attainment from a Community Perspective, which provides a look at our understanding of educational equity from the perspective of the 77 community areas in Chicago that CPS students call home, as well as the release of the accompanying To&Through Community Milestones tool, which we are hoping can serve as a resource to help all of the various stakeholders throughout our city continue to help organize and advocate for supports for young people in every community area to help make sure that they are reaching their intended post-secondary outcomes. Today's event is actually the first of a few events we're trying to host in support of these resources, and that we hope you will be able to join us for in the coming weeks. So on November 9th, we will be hosting a discussion with representatives from Enlace Chicago, Teamwork Inglewood, and Build Chicago, who will be sharing some more about their approach to community-based supports of CPS students and the role that data can play. And then on November 17th, we will be hosting a conversation with our friends from Chicago Community Trust, MAPS Corps, and List Chicago to learn about some of the data resources that they both produce and use, and ways that community-centered data can be used to increase equity across our city. So before we dive into the report and the demo of the tool today, I want to welcome some of my co-authors. We'd like to share a little bit about ourselves. So again, this project is a collaboration between the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research and the To&Through Project. You'll be hearing from my two brilliant colleagues here today, who are both actually CPS grads, one of whom is actually included in this data. But also, before we go any further, want to just recognize our colleague, Alex Usher, who we believe is tuning in from home due to the fact that she is home with her brand new healthy baby boy, Theodore. So congratulations, Alex. And thank you for all the work that you put in this project as well. We'd also like to take a moment to thank just the rest of our To&Through team and our colleagues at the consortium whose support was instrumental in making sure this project crossed the finish line. So thank you all so much. As I mentioned earlier, this report is about Chicago. So you'll notice that we also wanted to share a little bit about some of the community areas that we've called home in the city that we all love. And so while we wanted to share, we also are curious about what other neighborhoods are represented here today. So I believe we just turned on the chat function. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to learn about what community area are you tuning in from? Where are you joining us from today? What community areas are represented here? I'm seeing Hyde Park, Rogers Park, Loud and Proud, Back of the Yards, Edgewater, Old Town, West Loop, Hyde Park, Glenview, now in Lakeview, Hyde Park, South Shore, Saguenash, Old Town, Logan Square, Bridgeport, love it, Romeoville, Brighton Park, Portage Park, love it, Bronzeville, South Loop, Greater Grand Crossing, got California, Wicker Park. There's 100 people on this call, so I'm not gonna be able to read every single one, but this is fantastic. This is beautiful to see. We're seeing folks logging in from almost every community area in the city, and I think is a great reminder of why we wanted to do this project. Y'all are really proud. I really like this. This is beautiful to see. And I think it's just a good reminder for all of us, right? That there is great work. There's amazing things happening all across the city in every single community area. There's great work that is happening on behalf of kids. And, we're hoping that this project can continue to contribute to some of that work that's happening. So thank you for joining. It's good to see everybody. So before we dive into the report, I want to just provide a little bit of background And to give credit where credit is due, this project was really inspired in a lot of ways by work that came out of Enlace, Chicago, in the Little Village Education Collaborative, who in 2017, after identifying college access as part of a key priority coming out of the Little Village quality of life planning process, set out to really, first and foremost, just understand what did college access look like for CPS students in the Little Village community. And so they actually produced this report, which is a fantastic piece of work. I really encourage folks to take a look at it if they haven't seen it. I think we're going to drop a link in the chat. But in this report, the team gathered, interviews, qualitative data from students and parents, and also put that alongside quantitative data that they actually got from the To&Through high school tool to look at college enrollment outcomes for students that attended their local high schools. And was a great example, I think, and sits in our head as one of kind of the best uses of the To&Through high school tool that provides data that we know is critical for high school and college success for every CPS high school in the city. But really trying to use that to really inform and help set some directions, some intentions around the supports that they can provide for young people in their community area. This was a great use of the data, the available data, the data that was available at the time. And it also, though, highlighted a key limitation in the To&Through high school tool's ability to approximate community outcomes, given that we live in a district that has embraced the idea of school choice and is a district that now, and this is something that we dive into in the report, is a district where 77% of CPS ninth graders and families no longer attend the CPS high school that they're assigned to or zoned for, which really sparked a variety of questions around how attainment from this community perspective may inform or change our understanding of educational equity in the city and the work that continues to need to happen. So, this was really a large part of the guiding vision of this project. I think for those of us that work in education, particularly here in Chicago, we've often rallied around this collective goal of ensuring that a student's zip code does not determine the educational outcomes and opportunities that are available to them. However, to date, I think in thinking about this project, we realized there have been few opportunities to really understand how we've been making progress and where we've been making progress towards that goal and where we may not have been. I think most importantly, given that this data I think it's important to note, this data cannot be divorced from the historical and current impacts of racial segregation that exists in our city. Decades of underinvestment in Chicago's communities of color. And I think, as we as a district and a city and as a system continue to have more direct conversations about race and center racial equity as a primary focus and driver of our work, we are really hoping that this data can provide an open and collective understanding of both the success that we've seen throughout the city, but also the opportunities that remain. So finally, before we jump into the report, when you take a look, you'll see that we spend a lot of time doing our best to be hyper intentional about both the opportunities that we think access to this data presents, but also the limits in the limited role that we think this data can play. We'll talk more about this later when looking at the tool, but there are a few notes of framing in the intro that we wanted to pull out before we dived into the report today. First, the intention that this data is really meant to be a starting place to ask deeper questions about the outcomes that are presented. A lot of things that we talked about as a research team is that, as a descriptive research report, we needed to be really clear that, while we believe strongly this data can do a really good job of telling us the who, what, where, and when, given that this is purely descriptive outcomes data, that critical why is not always present in this data, which I think leads to the second point, that as consumers of this data, we wanted to recognize the need for us to all push ourselves past habits of deficit interpretation. And that true solutions in some of the gaps and opportunities that we're seeing will require us to continue to elevate student stories, students' lived experiences that exist behind this data to develop true student-centered and community-centered solutions. It's also part of the reason why we believe deeply that this data will be particularly effective in the hands of true community-centered practitioners and leaders who have a deep understanding of community strengths and also of their students. And finally, in the report, we actually borrowed this concept of expanded accountability from our colleague, Dr. Eve Ewing, and her team at the Beyond Schools Lab here at the university, which argues for a more holistic view of accountability that interrogates and holds non-educational decision makers accountable for the ways that their actions contribute to the environment which students, teachers, and schools are trying to succeed. And as their team writes, thinking about expanded accountability is a way to spur education researchers, leaders, advocates to look beyond school buildings and school policies for a view of the broader ecological factors that shape students' lives, and to challenge those working in other areas such as housing and transportation to think inclusively and expansively about how their work is related to school outcomes. We found that charge to be incredibly helpful as a research team, and as we continue to think about ways that we can take some of this data and research and really start to think about, be creative about ways that we can put it into action. So we also wanted to share that before we dive in. But with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Sonia in a moment. One note, just as we're going through the research, I wanted to point out that on your screens, there should be a Q&A function that you can use to ask questions. Please feel free to drop questions in as we're going through the report. We'll do our best to answer those in real time. And for those that maybe need a little bit longer of an explanation, we'll hold some time at the end for some verbal answers. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dom. So before we dive into high school and college attainment by community area, we first need to understand, where do CPS ninth graders live and go to school? First of all, it is important to note that we are using the 77 community areas of Chicago as our unit of analysis, not neighborhoods. Conceptions of neighborhoods change over time, and depending on who you ask, the boundaries of a neighborhood could be completely different. For our analysis, it was crucial that we have consistent boundaries over time, and the 77 community areas have remained relatively consistent over the last 100 years, and they have been used by many other organizations to map data across the city. So as you can see in this map, the concentration of CPS, this map shows you the concentration of CPS ninth graders in 2018 to 2019 school year by community area. As you can see, most community areas have approximately 100 to 500 students, and community areas with the highest concentration of ninth graders are located on the southwest and west sides of the city. We also saw that the patterns of racial segregation that we see in the city's overall population are also reflected in the CPS ninth graders, with Black and Latinx ninth graders being the most likely to reside in a community area where other ninth graders are the same race as them. And one thing that's important to note is that we have a big limitation to our paper in that it is only looking at Chicago public high school students. According to the US Census Bureau, approximately 12.4% of Chicago's overall high school population attend private schools. And as this map shows, private school enrollment is particularly high for certain community areas. Our report and tool paint an incomplete picture of the experiences of high school students in community areas with high concentrations of private school enrollment, particularly Mount Greenwood, Edison Park, and Beverly, that have over half of their students in private schools. Our tool provides the private school enrollment data for each community area, so you can look into this for further context. And one of the main motivators of this project was the fact that school choice has really expanded in Chicago, that further decouples the relationship between high schools and community areas in which their students live. So as you can see on the next slide, Only 23% of CPS ninth graders choose to attend their assigned neighborhood school in 2018, which is a huge decline compared to 20 years ago when almost half of ninth graders were going to their assigned neighborhood school. And while most ninth graders still do attend a neighborhood school, or did in 2018 and continue to do so today, but 20% of those students are attending neighborhood schools that are not their assigned school. 25% of ninth graders were attending charter schools, 15% at selective enrollment schools, and 17% at other schools that had no attendance boundaries and allowed citywide enrollment. As you can see with the map on the map on the right, there is no discernible pattern in where different types of schools are located. Yet we see stark differences in the types of schools students are enrolling in based on the racial makeup of said community area. Other reports, such as the annual regional analysis conducted by CPS, have already found that patterns of school choice vary by race and the region where students live. But we wanted to see what this looks like by community areas in particular. So thinking about the question of racial equity and school choice, we categorized community areas by what racial ethnic group comprised over 50% of their ninth grade population. As you can see here, there are 30 community areas in Chicago where over 50% of the ninth graders are Black. Then, to see the differences in school type enrollments, we looked at whether or not over 25% of ninth graders living in a community area went to a particular type of school. I'm going to apologize for my heater. It is a very Chicago thing to have in the background. Please note that these categories are not mutually exclusive, so the columns do not sum to 30. Only 2 out of 30 majority Black community areas have over a quarter of their students attending their assigned neighborhood school, while 10 out of 30 majority Black community areas had over a quarter of their students attending a neighborhood school that was not their assigned neighborhood school. In most majority Black community areas, 22 out of 30, more than a quarter of their students attended charter schools. Meanwhile, only 2 out of 30 majority Black community areas had over a quarter of their students attending selective enrollment schools, and only 4 out of 30 had over a quarter attending citywide schools. Now, when we look at community areas that have different racial majorities or no racial majority, we see drastically different patterns. We see that for 13 out of 26 majority Latinx community areas, over a quarter of their students are enrolled in their assigned neighborhood school. And none of the majority Latinx community areas have a quarter of their students attending a selective enrollment high school. Contrasting this to the fact that 4 out of 7 of the which makes up over half of the community areas that have a white majority had over a quarter of their students attending their assigned neighborhood school, and the same goes for selective enrollment schools. Meanwhile, none of the majority white community areas had over a quarter of their students attending charter schools. Similarly, both of the majority Asian Pacific Islander community areas had over a quarter of their students attending selective enrollment schools and other neighborhood schools. In 7 out of 9 community areas with no racial majority, that means no racial group makes over 50% of the ninth grade population, over a quarter of the ninth graders were enrolled in their assigned neighborhood school. If you want to create your own version of this graph, or you want to see what community areas fall under each of these categories, you can do so in our tool through the filter function, which Dom will show you at the end of our presentation. So these types of variation on school choice by racial group raise questions about the availability of information, time, and support for making choices about different types of schools across different community areas, and what types of schools are realistically accessible to students from communities with different racial ethnic makeups. So to further explore the relationship between high schools and the community areas where students live, we looked at what we call a dispersion ratio, which looks at for every 100 students in a community area, how many schools do they attend? In this graph, each of the bars represents a community area, and the color corresponds to the majority race of the ninth graders in that community area. And on the y-axis, you see the number of schools the students in that community area attend per 100 students. As you can see, there is quite a range. Some community areas have as low as 5 schools that their students attend, or as high as 40 schools per 100 students. And there is a stark pattern by race. As you can see, majority Black community areas are concentrated at the higher end of the graph, meaning that they are more likely to have students dispersed across several different schools. What this means is that you can go to a high school as a student where possibly only 1 or 2 other students are coming from the same community area as you. And this raises questions about how can schools be able to meet the needs of a student based on the community area that they come from? Or for community-based organizations, how will they be able to meet the needs, the educational needs of the students in their community if their students are dispersed all across the city? To further explore this, I'll pass it on to outcomes in particular. I'll pass it on to Jenny.
Great, thank you so much, Sonia. So next we're going to turn to educational attainment and examine 3 key attainment milestones: high school graduation, college enrollment, and college graduation. But first, I wanted to take a look at district rates. So the To&Through Project and the consortium have highlighted how CPS students are graduating from high school and going on to college and completing college at increasing rates over the past 10 years. So we see that high school graduation rate, for example, has gone up by 15 percentage points from 67% to 82%. We've also seen increases in 2-year and 4-year college enrollment of 7 percentage points, and also an increase in the number of college enrollees who are completing 2 and 4-year colleges, including certificates, associate degrees, and bachelor's degrees. So, these are life-changing outcomes for thousands of students that we should celebrate. But as the district and the city are increasingly focusing on equity, it really isn't enough to see improvements in district rates. It's critical that we're ensuring that each and every student, regardless of which neighborhood they live in, has a high likelihood of graduating from high school, going on to college, and completing a college certificate or degree. And with this report and the tool that Dom's going to show us in a bit, we can really see whether or not we're following through on our promises around equity for our students, and have the data to engage in the idea of expand accountability developed by Dr. Reviewing that Dom mentioned earlier. So first, we can take a look at the 2019 high school graduation rates within 4 years for high school students in 2 ways. First, by the high school that students attend, and then by the community area for the same students, where the same students live. Okay. And so starting out here, we're looking at high school graduation rates by CPS high school. So each bar represents one of the high schools in CPS, and the height of the bar is the graduation rate for that high school. And here we can see a huge range of high school graduation rates, going from less than 50% to almost 100%. And this is probably a picture of really different levels of attainment across high schools that we're really familiar with. But when we look at these exact same students by the community area where they live, we see a very different picture. The rate of high school graduation rate in 2019 by community area are relatively similar and are also uniformly high, so that in 3/4 of community areas, the rate is above 80%. So what this means is that in community areas across the city, it's the norm for students to be graduating from high school. And if we go back and forth here, you can really see the contrast between what the patterns look like by community area versus high school, where there's this really big difference by high school, but across community area, there's a relatively uniform high level of high school graduation. And next, I want to take you a little bit back in time so you can see how remarkable this actually is. In 2005, the consortium released a report by Lane Allensworth that looked at high school graduation rate by community area for the classes of 2002, 2003 combined. At that time, in all but 6 of the community areas had high school graduation rates below 60%. And today, for the class of 2019, there's not a single community area that has a high school graduation rate that low. So this is truly a transformative change for our students, and it's actually happened equitably in community areas across our city. And so next, we're going to take a look at the immediate 2-year and 4-year college enrollment rate for 2019 high school graduates. And again, we'll first take a look at these rates for CPS students by the high school they attended, and then we'll look at the same college enrollment rates by the community area where they lived. Okay, and so here we're looking at college enrollment by high school. And again, the high schools are arranged by overall college enrollment, with the 2-year colleges in the darker purple at the bottom and the 4-year enrollment at the top in the higher color. And here you can really see the range of college enrollment rates, which are spanning from less than 40% to over 90%. So there's really this big difference between the lowest rate and the highest rate. So the CPS overall rate is kind of in the middle of the distribution, and there's a lot of high schools that are lower, and there's a lot of high schools that are higher. And then next, when we look at the same thing for the same 2019 graduates by community area, and we actually, by the community where they live, and while there are differences by community area, they aren't nearly as large as what we saw when we looked at the same students sorted by the high school that they graduated from. And we also see that in almost every community area, over half of 2019 high school graduates enrolled in college immediately after graduation. And so here again, this is the norm, or at least half of students are graduating from college across communities across the city. And if you go back and forth, you can also see how different these patterns are, where it's relatively flat by community area. And then we here in the purple, look at high schools, there's really this steep difference between the lowest and the highest about it. And so finally, we're going to turn to college graduation. So we're going to look at college graduation from both 2-year and 4-year colleges, meaning that they completed a certificate, associate degree, or bachelor's degree. And this is only among students who made an immediate transition to college right after they graduated from high school. And we're allowing 6 years for students from the time that they made that transition to college. And again, this is going to be by the high school that students attended, and then by the community area where those same students lived. And so here, we're looking at this by high school. It's by the high school that students graduated from. And here in particular, we're seeing this enormous range of rates. So there's some rates that are less than 10%, and then there's some that are almost 90%. And actually the majority of high schools have college graduation rates below the CPS rate of 46%. So there's this really big difference. And then next, when we're looking at the same patterns by the community area where students live, the picture is a little bit different than what we saw for high school graduation and college enrollment. And while this range is not nearly as large as what we saw by high school, we do see that there are a number of community areas where fewer than a third of immediate college enrollees complete college within 6 years. And then there's other community areas where it's 2/3 of college enrollees are completing college. And if you go back and forth, you can sort of see how there are big differences by community area, but it's not nearly as big as what we see by the high school that students attended. So while students are graduating high school and enrolling in college at relatively similar rates in the 77 community areas across Chicago, once students leave high school and enter college campuses, we start to see bigger differences by community area. So looking at college completion rates by community area, it may seem discouraging. It may seem that we will never be able to live up to our belief in equity and having a city where students, regardless of where they live, are able to achieve their aspirations and graduate from college. But I want to remind you about where we were 20 years ago with high school graduation. We have moved from a city where in almost every community area, fewer than 60% of students graduated from high school, to one where in every single community area in Chicago, students are graduating at rates above 60%. And 20 years ago, nobody would have ever thought that that was possible. This was a life-transforming change for our students and for their communities. So now that it is the norm for students to graduate from high school, no matter where they live. And we are starting to see promising changes in support for students once they start college. The higher education community is starting to recognize that college students today are very different from the students who were on college campuses 20 years ago, as more and more first-generation college students of color, like those coming from CPS, are enrolling in college. Supporting this new generation of college students is going to require evolving college campuses to recognize that more students today than before face challenges such as food and housing insecurity, trauma from violence in their communities, and other work and family responsibilities. But ensuring that this new generation of college students graduate cannot be done by colleges alone. Many of the challenges that students face are rooted in disinvestment in the communities where they live and require more than a Band-Aid put on by colleges. The solutions for supporting colleges should be broader and more systemic. If we use this community lens, we can think about how to support our students once they leave our schools and enter college, and what they need in their communities to make sure that they are able to engage in college fully and be successful. And this is something that matters not just for the students and their families, but for their communities and for our city as a whole. And now I will turn it over to Dom, who will walk us through the To&Through Community Milestones tool, which can be a starting point for engaging in discussions and plans about how to support students through a community lens.
Thank you, Jenny. Before I'm gonna give a little bit of background, then do a quick demo of the tool. Want to just acknowledge we do have some questions come in. Really appreciate those. Keep those coming, and we will have some time after the demo to get to those. So yeah, like Jenny said, we are incredibly excited to share To&Through Community Milestones tool, which is live and available, publicly available, starting today. And again, we really think that this, while it is incredibly important to understand community attainment from a district perspective, there's a lot of power in being able to understand that at a true community level, which we'll talk about and show on the tool. Before we get into that, we have to, this is a project that has been legitimately 3 years in the making. I want to publicly say thank you to all the people who allowed me to talk their ear off about asking questions about this, got feedback from. Want to say thank you to the over 60 early testers and users of the tool, many of whom represented organizations that you see here who provided truly critical feedback on how we can continue to be thoughtful about the design, the data that's available, and to help inform our vision for how this data can inform our larger effort across the city. So truly, truly, truly appreciate the help. I think in a lot of ways, this has been one of our most collaborative projects to date for the To&Through team, and just really appreciate all of you showing up for us. Much of what we heard in a lot of the conversations and the feedback that we got really did help to clarify, I think, the framing and purpose of this tool. First and foremost, we heard, I think loud and clear, the need to fill this gap that was identified as community-based education data, which clearly existed for efforts like Little Village Education Collaborative we talked about earlier, and other place-based support organizations and collective impact efforts that often don't always have reliable and accessible data on hand to support their work, who may not always have the capacity to do their own analysis. Part of the hope here was to be able to provide this public resource, take some of that lift so that organizations can focus on what they do best, having, knowing their community areas, providing direct supports and options like that. We also, again, understand that we cannot separate this project from the impacts of racist policies and segregation we know that, that are influencing student experiences across our city. We believe in that, understanding the story of attainment at a community level, creates opportunities for community-based solutions, and opportunities for that continued advocacy for those necessary supports to meet students' needs. And finally, the plan for this tool is that we'll be updating this data on an annual basis, just like we do with our To and Through high school milestones tool. And we feel that this is particularly important as we are continuing to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic that we know has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color throughout our city. And we believe strongly that these rates are going to be incredibly important to keep watching as we continue to understand the effect this has had on high school and post-secondary access and success, and can be a critical lever for many of us as we continue to center racial equity in this effort. We also want to thank our partners for helping us get clear about what this tool cannot do. And also, I think drawing from a lot of quantitative critical race theory, experts and scholars throughout the city. We wanted to also just pull out a quote that is also in the intro. Data can be a powerful tool for disrupting inequitable systems and reimagining new ways of meeting the needs of those living in community areas disproportionately impacted by racist policies. However, this information is rarely enough to spur collective action, change practices, or disrupt policies. We wanted to be super clear that data is not going to do the work, right? Again, we feel strongly that this can provide a really great starting place for that who, what, where, and when, but finding out that critical why will require all of us and users of this tool to really take a critical eye to interpreting what you can learn. And I think doing that extra work again to elevate student stories, understand the history and context that lives behind all of this data so that we can continue to be creative and thoughtful about ways that we can develop supports to meet students' needs. With all of that, let's pop into the tool. I'm gonna do a very quick demonstration just for the sake of time. First thing I wanted to show, again, if you visit our website, I think we will have a link in the chat shortly. You will see that our landing page for our data tools has changed. Here you can access the kind of more traditional To and Through high school milestones tool, look at all of this data from the perspective of high schools in CPS. But now you also have the opportunity to explore the community tool. A couple of things I wanted to point out. We did include a 2-pager user guide, again, trying to provide a little bit of that context around what you can learn from the tool, also provide some guiding questions that can be used when exploring your community areas in the tool. So as we can see, we're borrowing a lot of the same interface from some of our past tools, but now the kind of unit of measurement that we're using is community areas where students live. So again, aggregating outcomes for all students that live in these community areas, regardless of where they go to high school. And like Sonia said, there's some opportunities to do some more citywide analysis. If we're interested in understanding, what are the community areas that have the highest rates of selective enrollment, or what are community areas that are predominantly serving Black CPS students, right? We have some opportunities to do some filtering in that way. And while we do believe that there are some opportunities to understand differences across community areas, we believe deeply that the true strength of this tool is being able to understand this story at a more granular level and at the community level. So what I'm going to do here is actually take us on a little bit of a tour of my community area, where I'm a recently moved to Portage Park, and wanted to just do a quick exploration. So if we click into Portage Park's page, we get an opportunity to see the high-level outcomes for each of these 5 milestones: freshman enrollment, high school graduation, college enrollment, college persistence, and college completion for students, CPS students that live in Portage Park. One really critical piece of feedback that we got from our early users was the need to establish some context. And so we've been able to pull in some census data on these community landing pages that provides a little bit of an opportunity to understand about who lives in Portage Park, right? So we can see total population, we can see what the racial breakdown is for this community, breakdowns by income. One thing I think is really important to note, as Sonia noted, about 12% of high school students in Chicago are not attending CPS, and that differs from community to community area. So we can see in Portage Park, there is a slight overrepresentation of students that do not attend CPS, but 85% of students that are high school students that live in Portage Park are attending CPS and are the students whose data is included on this tool. So I'm just gonna click into a couple of these milestone pages. On each one, you see there's a button to see the data. We start with freshman enrollment, which provides an understanding of both total numbers, how many students that live in Portage Park started high school in CPS over time. You can see those total numbers here at the top, but also for those cohorts of students, what was their breakdown racially? Looking across community areas, we can see, while Portage Park has stayed relatively steady, we see that there are demographic changes happening throughout the city that are also sometimes reflected in the CPS 9th grade population. We're also providing a breakdown of the top 5 enrolling high schools for CPS freshmen that live in Portage Park. Again, getting into this understanding of dispersion, we can see that for students that live in Portage Park, Taft is actually the #1 option. And there's a variety of other schools that students are attending in fairly large numbers, but we also have about 45% of students that live in the community attending a high school other than these top 5, right? In numbers lower than this 38. We also get an opportunity to look at what types of high schools are students enrolling in that live in Portage Park. So we have 5 categories here in the tool. We can see that 19% of students, CPS freshmen from Portage Park, enrolled in a CPS high school, a neighborhood high school that was one that was other than the one that they were assigned. 28% enrolled in their assigned neighborhood high school, 15% in a charter school, 16% select enrollment, 21% citywide option. Can also look at how that compares with this overall city rates. And then again, we can see how these trends have changed over time. Here we can look, we've seen a slight expansion in selective enrollment in freshman enrollees, and a small drop, not an insignificant drop in students that are attending their assigned neighborhood school, which again, I think opens up a lot of questions about patterns and options that are available to different students throughout CPS. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every page, but I do want to click into a couple other pages before we turn it over for questions. On our college enrollment page, you get an opportunity to take a look at, for CPS graduates from Portage Park, what types of colleges did those students enroll in compared to the overall city CPS rates. We can also see, again, that top 5 colleges that students from Portage Park are enrolling in. Can look at it by 4-year or by 2-year. We can see how these trends have changed over time for students that live in Portage Park. And then on most of our pages, I think this is arguably one of the most important parts of the tool, we get an opportunity to look at this data disaggregated by things like race or gender, or race and gender. So For here at Portage Park, we can disaggregate this latest year of outcomes by race and gender, get an opportunity to, for instance, understand how has college enrollment changed over the past 10 years for Latino young men that live in Portage Park. How has it changed for 4-year enrollment or 2-year college enrollment? And then as you can see on each of these bars, we also provide both the CPS rate for Latino young men, overall CPS rate, as well as rates for neighboring community areas. And again, finally, to this larger conversation around college completion, we also provide an opportunity to understand the 6-year completion rate for both students that are earning degrees and certificates for students that live in Portage Park. We can look at these rates for students that immediately enrolled in a 4-year or a 2-year, or just understand the overall rates. Again, we can see how these trends have changed over time. And again, disaggregate this data by things like race and gender. So again, we're hoping this can be some of those starting places to ask some of these questions around understanding the stories, the experiences, the supports that are available in different community areas that may be informing some of these rates. Intentionally, this demo was quick. We did not even visit high school graduation page, college persistence page, because this is a lot of data. In some ways, we like to think about this not even just being one tool, but a tool where you can talk about 5 different milestones. So we really do encourage you to take some time with this. I can talk your ear off about it all day, but we really do believe that taking the time to explore your community area, explore community areas that you're familiar with is a great place to start with this resource, and really do encourage you all to take the opportunity to take some time to take a look. And we are always available for questions. With that, we have about 10 minutes left. We did want to open it up to questions that have been coming in. Sounds like we have a couple that are queued up to answer live. So Sonia, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, so Sindel, thank you for attending, asked a really good question about what the patterns of enrollment and dispersion and variation across different types of schools means for elementary schools. And honestly, this is something that we have been working on a little bit to try to develop with middle schools. We're not really thinking about school choice in particular, but through our middle grades network, we have been thinking about developing a middle grades tool that will come out in 2022 in the fall, hopefully. But I think that right now, one thing that could be potentially useful is for high school counselors, for middle school elementary counselors that are going through this process of trying to figure out where to apply and where to send kids and such. They could look at the high school enrollment page for the community areas in which their students come from, right? So usually most elementary schools do draw from very rigid attendance boundaries compared to high schools. So looking at which community areas are in those attendance boundaries and then seeing what are the enrollment patterns? What schools did students previously enroll in, and what types of schools did they enroll in? And then you could see those changes over time. You can also see that by race and gender and such. So I think that those things could be useful tools for counselors to really tap into their own knowledge of their experiences working with students and parents about what their community members need, because they have that knowledge more than we ever could, while also using the data as a way of, just seeing what's happening, right? And just answer the what and where. And it's not a complete answer. Obviously, this is something that I think needs a lot more interviews with actual parents and students and such to understand what these trends really mean.
Shannon, do you want to share a little bit about Maureen's question?
Sure. It's actually Maureen Kelleher has a couple of excellent questions, and I'm glad you're here. Good to well, I can't see you, but glad you're here, Maureen. So the first question that Maureen posed was asking about the high school graduation rates by high school versus community area, and asking one, does this suggest that access to high school choice increase students' chances of graduating? I mean, it's a good question, and really, I mean, the honest answer is that this report doesn't answer that question. We know that this surfaces a lot of questions around high school choice and the impact on these outcomes, but we really don't know. I mean, we don't know if by choosing different schools, students who would not have graduated actually did, or the converse could actually be true. School choice is a really complicated and controversial issue. And here we're just looking at patterns. We're hoping that this is like the right sort of question that people are raising about this, and that they can start to answer. There is work out of the consortium that has looked at school choice and the impact on high school graduation and college going. And I think there it sort of shows how complicated this story is. It's not a binary, oh, it's good or bad. It depends on who the students are, their achievement level, where they end up going to high school, the type of high school. So, I think the basic answer is we're not sure based on what we see in this particular report. The second part of Maureen's question was asking about whether or not the differences by high school and community areas, whether that suggests that high school culture is the primary determinant of a student's chances of graduating. I mean, again, I think it may be suggestive of that, but I think, again, from this report, we don't know that. The good news is that we actually sit on a lot of research done at the consortium, particularly if you think about freshmen on track, where the freshman on track indicator, which looks at whether or not students have enough credits to be promoted to 10th grade and have had no more than one semester failure in a core class. And this is highly predictive of high school graduation. So how students perform in their freshman year in their classes matters more than all their 8th grade test scores, their demographics, all these different things that people used to think really mattered about whether or not students graduate from high school. It turns out the experience and the grades that students are getting in high school tell us a lot more about whether or not they will ultimately graduate from high school. So in this case, I would say it's, our report doesn't speak to that, but there's a lot of research which does say that above and beyond the communities where students live or their family background, their experience in high school is what really shapes whether or not they are going to graduate from high school.
We also had another question that asked about, I mean, if this report looked at differences, some of the differences that we see in college graduation outcomes between high school and community areas, if we looked at what it has to do with types of colleges the students are attending or even specific colleges, this report does not look at that specifically, but I think that's a very logical extension of I think some of the work that is to come. While this report doesn't look at that specifically, some of the other work that we've done that's been focused on just talking to CPS graduates that are continuing to navigate their own college journeys, I think highlights a lot of the points that Jenny was making, is that it's incredibly complex. We know that, college going can be a kind of highly individualized process, and each family has different needs and resources they're able to put into this process. And so, I think it is, while there's work that is happening and I think will continue to happen at the college level, I think part of the hope is to continue to think about this expansively. What are the opportunities to continue to refine, our high school guidance systems to help ensure that students are finding options where they can continue to persist, build pipelines where we are seeing success. I think in some ways, helping to understand what happens if you do need to make a change, right? We know that transfers in your college process happen for CPS students. Something that we heard from CPS students that we talked to is that, oftentimes they found themselves with very little information about how to even navigate that process. And so, I think these are all the types of conversations that, I think we can have. And I think part of the hope is that, we all have kind of a role to play in each of our individual roles. And I think, asking those questions from your perspective, I think is a really great place to start. Looks like we got one more. Son, you want to try to answer this one quickly? Or
Which one, Dom, do you want me to answer?
oh, it looks like you're typing it. Well, we got one
Yes.
more. Can you tell us how Enlace and Little Village Group has used this data? No, but you can come on November 9th to hear it from them themselves. Thank you for that question, Marvin. I do think, since we are running tight on time, I think we may call it there. But again, please take a look at this report. Please, take a look at the To and Through Community Milestones tool. This is live and available. I know this has been coming for a long time. And again, to Marvin's question, please join us, for our continued conversations with all of our work. The goal is, not for this to just exist because it's interesting. We want to find opportunities for this data and research to inform action. So we're looking forward to that conversation to learn more about some of Enlace's work, Build Chicago's work, and Teamwork Inglewood's work. So please feel free to join us if you can. And once again, so on behalf of our team, would just like to truly say thank you for all the support and interest in this project. We are incredibly excited about being able to release this today, and have also placed some of our contact information here. Please feel free to reach out to us. Our goal in a lot of ways is, this is just the beginning. We want to continue to talk about these resources, support you all in putting some of this data to work. So if there are ever questions, please feel free to reach out, and we would love to find opportunities to collaborate. And with that, thank you all for joining today.